Chapter 1. The Cracks in the Mirror. The story begins where most stories like this do. In a town so ordinary, it might as well have been invisible. Summerfield, tucked between sprawling fields and dense woods, was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. It didn't attract attention. It didn't inspire nostalgia. But for the 5 friends who called it home, it was the center of their small universe. A place where they felt safe enough to let the days slip by without question. It was the summer of 1997. The air was heavy with the sticky warmth of late June, and the cicadas had begun their ceaseless chorus. The world hummed with an energy that felt both timeless and fleeting. It was the kind of summer that made you feel invincible, as though nothing bad could happen, as though the long stretch of days ahead promised only lazy afternoons and whispered secrets. But that was the thing about Summerfield. It lulled you into a sense of security, a sense of predictability, even as the cracks began to form. It started with something small, a photograph. Lily had found it tucked away in the attic of her grandmother's house, a place they all swore was haunted. The picture was old, black and white and grainy, with the edges curling from time. It showed a group of children standing in front of what looked like a rundown cabin in the woods. Their faces were blurred, not from age but from motion, as though they had turned away at the last second. All except one. In the center of the group, a girl stared directly into the camera, her eyes impossibly sharp and piercing. Something about her felt wrong. Lily couldn't explain it, but she didn't have to. The others felt it too when she showed them. The photograph became a kind of artifact for their group, a piece of mystery in a town that seemed devoid of it. They joked about it at first, calling the girl the Watcher and spinning elaborate stories about who she might have been. But as the days went on, the jokes stopped. Strange things started to happen. Small, almost imperceptible things that could easily be brushed off if you didn't look too closely. A light flickering when no one was near the switch. A faint sound of footsteps in empty hallways. Items disappearing, only to reappear in places no one remembered leaving them. It wasn't long before they decided to investigate the cabin in the photograph. They had all grown up hearing rumors about the woods on the edge of town. People said there was something wrong with them, though no one could agree on what. Some claimed they were cursed, that anyone who went too deep would lose their way and never come back. Others whispered about strange figures seen moving between the trees at night. But for the friends, the woods were familiar territory. They had spent countless summers exploring its trails, daring each other to go further and further into the unknown. The day they set out to find the cabin, the air felt different, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a muted, greenish glow. The group walked in silence, their usual chatter replaced by an unspoken tension. It was Lily who led the way, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. Behind her were James and Mara, the couple who always seemed inseparable, followed by Nate and Celeste, whose easy friendship had always been the glue that held them all together. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar trails began to change. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable wall. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and refused to leave. They began to see signs of something strange. Symbols carved into tree trunks, faint trails of ash scattered across the ground. And then, just as they were about to turn back, they saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. It looked exactly like it did in the photograph, right down to the warped wooden door hanging off its hinges. But there was something else, a feeling, as though the air around it was charged with electricity. It made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Lily was the first to step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The others hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to leave, to run as far and as fast as they could. But they didn't. They couldn't. Something about the cabin pulled them in, held them captive in its silent, malevolent grip. The inside was worse than they could have imagined. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading to the center of the room. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols they had seen in the woods, some carved deep into the wood, others painted in what looked uncomfortably like blood. And in the center of the room, directly beneath a hole in the ceiling where the light poured through like a spotlight, was a mirror. It was old, its once ornate frame now rusted and cracked. The glass was cloudy, the kind of surface that seemed to swallow reflections rather than show them. And yet, as they stood there, they could see something moving within it, something that didn't belong. None of them could say how long they stood there, staring into the mirror, their breaths shallow and their hearts racing. But eventually, something broke the spell. A sound, faint and distant, like the laughter of a child carried on the wind. It was enough to make them turn, to run, to leave the cabin and the woods behind. They didn't talk about it after that. Not really. They tried to go back to their normal lives, to pretend that nothing had happened. But the cracks had already begun to form. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the mirror waited. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Pines. The cabin haunted them in ways they couldn't quite articulate. In the days that followed, none of the friends spoke about what they'd seen, but the weight of the experience clung to them like a second skin. It wasn't fear, exactly. Not the kind you could name or push away, but a subtle, pervasive unease. It crept into their dreams, threaded through their thoughts, and settled in their hearts like a parasite. Lily was the first to notice the changes. She had always been the one to pay attention to the small things, the subtle shifts in the world that others dismissed. Her grandmother had called it an old soul, though Lily sometimes felt it was more of a curse than a gift. It started with the forest. The woods behind her grandmother's house had always been her sanctuary. She loved the way the light filtered through the trees, the earthy scent of pine needles and moss, the quiet solitude. But now, it felt different. The trees seemed taller, darker, as though they had grown overnight. The trails she knew by heart twisted in unfamiliar ways, leading her to places she didn't recognize. The birds were silent. The air was colder, and sometimes, when she stood very still, she thought she could hear something, faint whispers, just beyond the edge of perception. She wasn't alone in noticing these things. Mara found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding as though she'd been running. Her dreams were vivid and fragmented. Flashes of the cabin, the mirror, the strange symbols on the walls. She couldn't remember the details, but the feelings lingered: dread, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. James, always the skeptic, tried to brush it off. "It's just our imaginations," he told Mara once, though his voice lacked conviction. He spent more time at the gym, working out his unease through physical exhaustion, but even that didn't help. The shadows in the corners of his vision seemed darker now, heavier, like they were alive. Nate and Celeste, usually the most easygoing of the group, grew quieter. Nate, who loved to sketch, found his drawings taking on a life of their own. He would start with something simple, a tree, a bird, a face, and before he realized it, the lines would twist into something else entirely. Shapes he couldn't explain, images that made his stomach turn. Celeste, who had always been a light sleeper, began to dread the night. She heard things in the quiet moments before sleep: soft knocks on her window, faint scratching sounds, distant laughter. By the end of the week, they were all avoiding each other. The group, once so inseparable, now felt fractured, like a puzzle with missing pieces. They each carried the weight of what they'd seen alone, too afraid to share it, too uncertain of what it all meant. And then the animals started to disappear. It began with the neighborhood cats. Mrs. Grayson's tabby, a fat, friendly creature who spent most of its time lounging on her porch, vanished without a trace. A week later, the Williams' golden retriever went missing from their fenced backyard. By the time a third pet, a parrot from a house on Birch Lane, disappeared, the town was abuzz with rumors. Some said it was coyotes, though no one had ever seen one in Summerfield. Others blamed teenagers or drifters, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. One evening, as she sat on her grandmother's porch, she saw it. A shadow, quick and fluid, moving through the trees at the edge of the yard. It was too fast to make out any details, but the shape of it didn't seem right. Too tall, too thin. Her heart pounded as she stared into the darkness, waiting for it to appear again. But it didn't. It was Celeste who found the first sign of something tangible, something that confirmed what they all feared but refused to say. She had been walking home from the grocery store, cutting through the edge of the woods to save time, when she saw the markings. They were carved into the trunks of 3 trees, arranged in a perfect triangle. The symbols were similar to the ones they'd seen in the cabin, though these were deeper, more deliberate. They seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin crawl. At the center of the triangle was a small mound of earth, freshly disturbed. She wanted to turn away, to keep walking and pretend she hadn't seen it, but something drew her closer. Her hands trembled as she knelt beside the mound and began to dig. The soil was loose and cold, and it didn't take long to uncover what lay beneath. It was a doll. At least, it had been. Its porcelain face was cracked, its dress torn and stained. Its eyes, once painted a cheerful blue, had been scratched out, leaving deep, jagged marks. Around its neck was a piece of red string, tied into a perfect bow. Celeste stared at it for a long time, her mind racing. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it wasn't good. She left it where she found it and ran the rest of the way home. The others dismissed it as a prank when she told them. At least, that's what they pretended to believe. But the doll stayed with them, a silent specter haunting their thoughts. They began to notice other strange things. Nate found scratches on his bedroom wall, in the same strange symbols they'd seen in the cabin. Mara discovered a photograph tucked into her locker at work, an old, faded picture of a girl with hollow eyes. And Lily woke one morning to find her mirror cracked, a single line running straight through the center. The whispers grew louder. The shadows grew darker, and somewhere, deep in the woods, the cabin waited. Chapter 3: A Room with Locked Doors. The storm rolled in without warning. That morning, the sky over Summerfield had been a soft, cloudless blue, the kind of day that begged for long walks and lazy sunbathing. By late afternoon, the air was suffocating, thick with the kind of oppressive heat that signaled something was about to change. The first crack of thunder sounded just as Lily was walking home from the store, the sky darkening so quickly it felt unnatural. The storm broke violently, with rain that fell in sheets and wind that howled like a living thing. By nightfall, the power had gone out across town, plunging Summerfield into an eerie silence broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder. It was the kind of night that made even the bravest hearts uneasy. For the friends, it was worse. The storm seemed to amplify the strange tension that had been growing among them, as though the weather itself was in on the secret. It wasn't just the darkness or the wind. It was the feeling that something was watching. Lily sat alone in her grandmother's house, a flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. She couldn't shake the sense that the house was different tonight. The familiar creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock, all the small noises that gave the old house life, were gone. In their place was a heavy, unnatural stillness. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words swam on the page, refusing to make sense. Her thoughts kept drifting to the photograph, the cabin, the mirror. The memories felt sharper tonight, as though the storm had stripped away the thin layer of denial she'd been clinging to. Her eyes flicked to the mirror hanging above the fireplace. It was an antique, with a tarnished brass frame and a faint crack running through the corner. She had always loved it. It reminded her of her grandmother, who used to check her hair in it before heading to church. But tonight, it felt wrong. She couldn't explain why, but she avoided looking at it for too long, as though afraid of what she might see. Across town, Mara and James sat in their darkened apartment, the candlelight casting flickering shadows across the walls. James had always prided himself on his practicality, but tonight, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier than it should, as though the storm had crept inside and taken up residence in their living room. Mara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. She stared at the window, where the rain lashed against the glass in violent, chaotic patterns. She thought about the dreams she'd been having, the ones she couldn't quite remember but couldn't forget either. Flashes of light, twisted shadows, the sound of laughter that wasn't her own. On the bookshelf across the room, their wedding photo lay face down. Neither of them had touched it. Neither of them had noticed. Nate, always the insomniac, paced the floor of his small studio apartment. He hadn't slept in 2 days, and his mind felt frayed, as though it were held together by threads too thin to bear the weight. His sketchbook lay open on the table, the pages filled with strange, tangled shapes he didn't remember drawing. He stopped at the window, staring out at the storm. The streetlights were out, and the neighborhood was bathed in a strange, bluish darkness. The trees in the distance swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. He thought about the symbols in the cabin, the ones Celeste had seen in the woods. They were etched in his mind now, burned there like a brand. He had started seeing them everywhere. In the cracks of the sidewalk, the patterns of the wallpaper, the frost on the window. He rubbed his eyes, trying to will the images away. But when he looked again, he swore he saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the rain. It was gone before he could blink. Celeste had taken to sleeping with the lights on, though tonight, it made no difference. The power outage had plunged her small house into darkness, and no amount of candles or flashlights could chase away the shadows. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about the doll she had found, the strange carvings on the trees, the feeling of being watched. She had tried to tell herself it was a prank, but she didn't believe it. The fear was too real, too visceral. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of the storm. But then she heard it, the faintest sound, almost imperceptible, like the creak of a floorboard. Her heart raced as she held her breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. A soft, deliberate creak, as though someone, or something, was moving through the house. She wanted to move, to grab the flashlight on her nightstand, to call out for help, but she was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt primal. The sound stopped just outside her bedroom door. And then, silence. The storm raged on, battering the town with wind and rain. But inside their homes, the friends were consumed by a different kind of tempest. Each of them felt it, the weight of something they couldn't name, something that tied them together in ways they didn't yet understand. And somewhere, in the heart of the woods, the cabin stood waiting. Its door creaked open, though no one was there to hear it. The mirror inside reflected nothing but darkness. Chapter 4. The Shadow We Chose to Follow. The storm cleared by morning, leaving Summerfield blanketed in a thick fog that refused to lift. It clung to the town like a second skin, muffling sound and obscuring the edges of everything. The world felt smaller, confined, as if the fog had stolen the horizon. For the group of friends, the new day brought no relief. The events of the night before lingered in their minds, sharp and unrelenting, like splinters beneath the skin. Sleep had been elusive, their dreams tangled with shadows and symbols they couldn't decipher. The weight of their shared silence grew heavier with each passing hour, but none of them reached out. None of them admitted they were too afraid to break it. James, ever the rational one, decided to channel his unease into productivity. He spent the morning repairing the old shed behind the apartment building, focusing on the rhythm of hammering nails and cutting planks. The work steadied him, kept the memories of the cabin and the mirror at bay. But the woods, visible just beyond the edge of the yard, were a constant presence, a reminder he couldn't escape. He didn't want to look at them, but his eyes betrayed him. Each time he glanced up, the trees seemed darker, closer, as though they were slowly encroaching on the edges of his world. Once, he thought he saw movement, something quick and darting between the trunks, but when he stared harder, there was nothing. Only silence. The shed was finished by midday, but James felt no satisfaction, only a hollow sense of delay. He didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he stood in the yard, staring at the woods, the hammer hanging limp in his hand. The fog swirled around him, cold and damp, and he thought he heard something faint, a whisper, too soft to understand. Mara's day was quieter, though no less unsettling. She had taken to cleaning, scrubbing the apartment from top to bottom, as though she could rid the space of whatever invisible force had taken root in their lives. The act of cleaning, of restoring order, gave her a sense of control, however fleeting. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The mirrors were the worst. Every time she passed one, she felt the urge to cover it, to turn it away from her. She didn't know why. The reflection she saw was her own, unchanged and ordinary. And yet, there was something about it that felt off. When she reached the bedroom, she noticed the wedding photo still lying face down on the shelf. It sent a shiver through her, though she couldn't explain why. She hesitated for a long moment before picking it up. The glass was smudged with fingerprints that weren't hers. Lily spent the morning wandering. She had no destination in mind, only the overwhelming need to be somewhere other than her grandmother's house. The old woman, usually so sharp and quick-witted, had seemed distant lately, her conversations trailing off into muttered fragments. Lily wondered if her grandmother felt it too, the sense of something wrong, something watching. Her feet carried her to the edge of town, to a place she hadn't been in years. The abandoned railway station loomed before her, its peeling paint and boarded-up windows a stark contrast to the cheerful summers she had spent there as a child. Back then, the station had been a place of wonder, its tracks leading to far-off places she could only dream of. Now, it felt like a monument to something forgotten, something lost. She climbed onto the platform, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The fog was thicker here, shrouding the tracks and swallowing the edges of the world. She stood there for a long time, staring into the gray void, her thoughts spinning in circles. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the fog. But as she squinted, the shape grew clearer. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless at the far end of the platform. Its face was obscured, its body barely visible, as though it were part of the fog itself. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to move, to run, but her legs refused to obey. She could only stand there, frozen, as the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed, not at her, but past her, toward the woods. She didn't know how long she stood there before the sound of a train horn startled her. When she turned back, the figure was gone. Nate stayed in his studio, the curtains drawn against the fog. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank page of his sketchbook, the pencil in his hand trembling. The urge to draw was overwhelming, but he was afraid of what might come out. The last time he had sketched, he hadn't been in control. The symbols were etched into his mind, refusing to fade. He tried to push them away, but they crept into the edges of his thoughts, whispering promises he couldn't understand. He wanted to call one of the others, to tell them what he was feeling, but he didn't know how to explain it. Instead, he flipped the page and began to draw. His hand moved on its own, the pencil gliding across the paper with a precision that wasn't his. The lines twisted and turned, forming shapes that felt familiar yet alien. When he finished, he stared at the image in horror. It was the mirror from the cabin, its cracked surface reflecting something that wasn't him. Celeste spent the day in bed, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical force. Her dreams had been relentless, pulling her into dark, twisting corridors where the walls pulsed with strange symbols and the air buzzed with whispers. When she finally rose, the house was too quiet. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator. Everything felt muted, distant. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she might disturb something unseen. In the hallway, she stopped. The door to the attic was ajar. It hadn't been the day before. Her breath hitched as she stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never gone into the attic. There was no reason to. It was filled with old furniture and forgotten relics of a family she barely knew. But now, the door seemed to beckon her, its dark interior like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She didn't go inside. Instead, she turned away, closing every door behind her as though they could protect her from whatever was waiting above. The day passed in silence, the fog refusing to lift, and as night fell, the friends each felt the same thing, a pull, deep and insistent, drawing them toward the woods. None of them would go, not yet, but they knew it was only a matter of time. Somewhere in the forest, the mirror was waiting, and whatever was inside it had begun to stir. Chapter 5. When the lights go quiet. The nights grew heavier after the storm, as if the sky had absorbed its own fury and now held it suspended in a vast, invisible weight. Summerfield was caught in its grip, the days and nights blurring together in an unsettling haze. For the group of friends, the sense of unease that had plagued them since the trip to the cabin had matured into something darker, something with edges they could almost feel but couldn't see. Each of them experienced it differently, yet the thread of commonality was undeniable. It was the woods, the mirror, the cabin. It was the symbols carved into their memories, the whispers they thought they'd imagined but knew they hadn't. And it was the sensation that whatever they disturbed was no longer confined to that place. Lily's days began to stretch into something surreal. She no longer recognized the world as it had once been. Familiar places felt altered, as though the essence of them had shifted. Her grandmother's house, which had always been a refuge, now felt like an artifact of someone else's life. The creak of the stairs, the smell of lavender and old wood, all of it seemed foreign, hollow. The woods called to her, though she tried to resist. Every time she looked out the window, the trees seemed closer, their dark silhouettes pressed against the glass like they were trying to see inside. She stopped sitting on the porch. She stopped walking through the backyard. But still, the pull was there, deep and magnetic. One night, she dreamed of the cabin. She was standing in front of it, the door ajar, the black void inside alive with something she couldn't name. When she woke, her reflection in the mirror beside her bed was distorted. Her face split into fragments by the crack that hadn't been there the day before. James threw himself into routine, hoping that order and discipline could counteract the chaos in his mind. He went to work, came home, fixed things that didn't need fixing, and buried himself in tasks until his hands were raw and his muscles ached. But the cracks were starting to show. He couldn't ignore the oddities that peppered his days. The tools that weren't where he'd left them, the faint sound of footsteps when he knew he was alone, the way the woods seemed to loom closer every time he glanced at them. One morning, as he was shaving, he noticed something strange in the mirror. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the background, gone as quickly as it appeared. But when he leaned closer, he saw them. Faint marks etched into the glass, symbols he recognized but couldn't decipher. They weren't scratches, not exactly. They were deeper, as if the mirror itself had absorbed them. He smashed the mirror with his fist and didn't bother to clean up the shards. Mara had taken to sleeping during the day and staying awake at night. It wasn't a conscious decision, but the darkness felt safer than the light. In the daylight, everything was exposed, the edges of her unease sharpened by clarity. At night, the shadows softened the world, made it easier to ignore the things she didn't want to see. But the nights weren't silent. The noises had started faintly, almost imperceptibly. A soft creak here, a rustle there. She told herself it was the apartment settling, the wind against the windows, anything but what she truly feared. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. One night, she woke to find her closet door ajar. She had closed it before bed. She always did. Inside, her clothes hung neatly, untouched. But on the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were shards of glass she didn't recognize. She didn't go back to sleep. Nate was no stranger to artistic obsession, but this was different. He spent hours in his studio, sketching feverishly, his hand moving faster than his thoughts. The images poured out of him in a torrent, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. He tried to stop, to step away, but the compulsion was too strong. The sketches filled his walls, his desk, the floor. They were the same symbols, over and over, interspersed with fragmented images of the mirror, the cabin, and something else, something he couldn't quite define. One night, as he was drawing, the power went out. He didn't stop. By the light of a single candle, he continued, his hand moving as if guided by something outside himself. When the candle burned out, he worked in the dark. When he woke the next morning, he found a new drawing pinned to the wall, one he didn't remember making. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing in the woods. Its face was featureless, its body nothing more than an outline. But its presence radiated menace, even from the page. Celeste had started avoiding mirrors altogether. She had draped cloth over the one in her bedroom and turned the bathroom mirror to face the wall. But it didn't matter. She still felt them. Reflections that didn't belong to her. Shadows that moved when she was still. The attic door continued to open on its own, despite her efforts to keep it shut. She nailed it closed, but the nails disappeared, leaving the door ajar once more. One evening, she ventured into the woods, drawn by a pull she couldn't resist. She told herself it was to clear her head, to prove to herself that nothing was out there. But as she walked, she felt the air grow colder, heavier. The fog thickened, and the trees seemed to close in around her. She found the clearing without meaning to. The trees formed a perfect circle, their branches intertwining above like a cage. In the center was a stone, flat and smooth, with the same symbols etched into its surface. When she reached out to touch it, the air around her seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, rhythmic pulse. She pulled her hand back and ran, the whispers following her all the way home. By the end of the week, the pull became impossible to ignore. Each of them felt it, deep and insistent, like a thread tugging at their very souls. The woods were calling, and the cabin waited. The mirror was ready to reveal what lay beyond. Chapter 6, Threads of Smoke. The fog began to dissipate as the week waned, but it left behind a world irrevocably changed. The air in Summerfield felt different, heavier, as though the town had been shifted slightly out of sync with reality. The streets seemed quieter, the spaces between the houses darker. Even the sunlight, when it pierced through the thinning haze, carried a pallid, sickly hue that did little to comfort the uneasy hearts of those who noticed. The group of friends had reached an unspoken understanding. Though none of them communicated directly, they knew they were being drawn towards something inevitable. It was a compulsion they didn't discuss, a gravity they didn't question. They moved through their days as though in a dream, their individual lives folding inward, their thoughts circling the same unspoken truths. The woods were waiting. Lily spent her mornings sitting by the window, staring out at the backyard. The once familiar landscape had become alien, the trees at the edge of the property looming like silent sentinels. She avoided going outside, though she couldn't say why. One afternoon, she found herself tracing patterns on the fogged-up window pane, her finger moving instinctively, the symbols forming beneath her touch before she realized what she was doing. When she stepped back, the shapes stared back at her, stark and deliberate. The symbols from the cabin. She wiped them away, but the motion only smeared them, leaving faint, ghostly echoes in the glass. James had taken up running in the evenings, hoping to outrun the strange sense of unease that seemed to cling to him. He pushed himself harder each night, his footsteps pounding against the pavement in a rhythm that drowned out his thoughts. But no matter how far he ran, the woods were always there, a dark line on the horizon that seemed to follow him. He stopped avoiding the trails, telling himself it was for the challenge, though deep down, he knew it was something else. One night, he ventured further than he ever had before, the cool air biting at his skin as the path twisted and turned. The trees grew denser, the shadows deeper. When he finally stopped, breathing heavily, he realized he didn't know where he was. The path had disappeared, swallowed by the forest. In the distance, through the tangled branches, he saw a faint light. It flickered like a candle, steady but unnatural. Without thinking, he moved toward it, the pull as undeniable as it was illogical. The light led him to a clearing he didn't recognize. At its center stood a lone tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like twisted fingers. Hanging from the lowest branch was a mirror, small and circular, its surface polished to a perfect sheen. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. The mirror reflected him, but the image wasn't his. Mara had begun cataloging the events of the past few weeks in a journal, hoping that writing everything down might help her make sense of it. But the more she wrote, the less things seemed to fit together. The timeline of events twisted and blurred, the details slipping through her fingers like sand. She flipped through the pages late one night, the candlelight casting dancing shadows across the words. She noticed, with a growing sense of dread, that some of the pages weren't in her handwriting. The style was jagged and uneven, the ink darker, as though pressed into the paper with more force. The words on those pages were fragments, incoherent and chaotic. Symbols mixed with phrases she didn't understand, descriptions of places she didn't remember visiting. But the final entry on the last page sent a chill through her. It was a single sentence, scrawled in the center of the page. The woods are open now. Nate's sketches had begun to take on a life of their own. He would leave his sketchbook closed at night, only to find new drawings the next morning. The images were darker now, the lines deeper, as though etched into the paper with something sharper than a pencil. One morning, he found a drawing of the cabin. The details were uncanny, from the warped wood to the cracks in the mirror. But in the foreground, there was something he hadn't seen before. A figure standing in front of the cabin, its back to the viewer. The figure's outline was blurred, its edges indistinct. But Nate could feel its presence emanating from the page, heavy and oppressive. It felt like an intrusion, as though whatever he had drawn wasn't meant to be captured on paper. He burned the page, but the image lingered in his mind. Celeste had stopped going to work. She couldn't bring herself to leave the house. though staying inside offered no comfort. The attic door remained open, no matter how many times she shut it. One afternoon, she decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the creaking stairs, her breath shallow and her hands trembling. The attic was cold, the air stagnant and heavy with dust. She shone the flashlight around the room, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, it revealed nothing but old boxes and forgotten furniture. But then she saw it, a mirror, leaning against the far wall. It was old, its frame tarnished and cracked. She didn't recognize it, but it filled her with a sense of dread so profound that she almost turned and ran. But something stopped her. As she stepped closer, the reflection came into view. It was her, but not her. The reflection moved independently, its eyes darker, its expression colder. She screamed, and the flashlight flickered out. The pull grew stronger with each passing day, the thread that connected them tightening, drawing them closer together. The woods were no longer a distant threat. They had become a part of them, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. And then, one by one, they began to gather. Lily, James, Mara, Nate, and Celeste. Each of them found themselves at the edge of the forest, drawn there without reason, without discussion. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The path into the woods stretched before them, winding into the darkness. It was the same path they had taken weeks ago, though it felt different now. It felt alive. As they stepped into the forest, the air grew colder, the light dimmer. The trees closed in around them, their branches intertwining above like a cage. And in the distance, the cabin waited. The mirror inside was no longer just an object. It was awake. Chapter 7. The Other Side of the Bridge. The forest was no longer a place of memory. It had become a living entity. Every step the group took along the path was accompanied by the soft rustle of unseen movements and the faint, rhythmic creaking of the trees. The air was damp, thick with the scent of moss and decay, clinging to their skin like a second layer. Time unraveled as they walked, the path winding and twisting in ways that defied logic. The woods stretched on endlessly, the familiar landmarks from their last visit now absent, replaced by towering trees that seemed to lean closer with every step. Shadows danced without light, their shapes shifting and darting just beyond the edge of vision. No one spoke. Words felt heavy, unnecessary, as though the forest itself demanded silence. Lily felt the weight of the woods more acutely than the others. It pressed down on her, its presence almost tangible, wrapping around her like an invisible net. Her breathing quickened as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from her dream standing behind her. But the path was empty, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. Not a person, but something far older, something that belonged to the woods in a way they never could. The pull that had brought her here hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger, tightening around her like a tether. It wasn't guiding her to safety. She knew that now. James walked at the front of the group, his jaw set and his fists clenched. He tried to focus on the path ahead, ignoring the way the trees seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. His thoughts were a jumble of logic and instinct, the rational part of his mind at war with the primal fear clawing at him. He had always been the protector, the one who kept the group grounded. But now, he felt powerless. The woods were a maze, and the cabin, if it even existed, felt like a distant memory. And yet, he couldn't stop walking. The pull was too strong, a force that defied reason. It wasn't guiding them, it was consuming them. Mara walked in the middle, her steps deliberate, her eyes darting to the sides of the path. She had been counting her steps at first, trying to impose some sense of order on the chaos. But she lost track somewhere in the hundreds, the rhythm of her counting drowned out by the whispers that seemed to rise and fall like a tide. The whispers weren't coming from the group. She was certain of that. They came from the woods, from the shadows that shifted and stretched with each passing moment. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried an intent that chilled her. She clutched the small notebook in her pocket, the one she had brought along without knowing why. The pages were blank when she left the apartment, but she could feel them now, heavy with ink that she didn't remember writing. Nate carried his sketchbook under one arm, his other hand trailing along the rough bark of the trees as he passed. The texture grounded him, gave him something tangible to focus on. But the images in his mind refused to be silenced. The sketches he had burned reappeared in his thoughts, clearer now than they had been on the page. The symbols, the figure, the mirror, it was all there, etched into his memory with a clarity that felt unnatural. He didn't need to open his sketchbook to know what was inside. He had stopped drawing days ago, but he could feel the weight of new pages, filled with images he hadn't created. He tried not to think about what they would reveal. Celeste brought up the rear, her steps faltering as she glanced up at the canopy above. The trees seemed alive, their branches twisting and writhing like limbs in slow motion. She could hear the faint creak of wood, a sound that reminded her of the attic door swinging open. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The attic mirror had shown her something she hadn't told the others. A face that wasn't hers, eyes that weren't her own. It had smiled at her, a cold, hollow expression that stayed with her even now. The woods knew her fear. She could feel it, the way the air seemed to thicken around her, the way the shadows reached for her like fingers. The pull wasn't a call, it was a demand. The path eventually began to change, the dense underbrush giving way to a clearing. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The cabin stood at the center, exactly as they remembered it. The walls were weathered, the roof sagging, but it exuded a presence that went beyond its physical form. The broken window was still there, the jagged edges glinting faintly in the dim light. And inside, the mirror waited. It wasn't visible from where they stood, but they felt it all the same. Its presence seeped out of the cabin like smoke, curling around them, filling their lungs with every breath. None of them hesitated. They stepped into the clearing as one, their movements slow, deliberate. The pull was irresistible now, drawing them toward the cabin like moths to a flame. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was heavy, saturated with the scent of rot and damp wood. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight as they crossed the threshold, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. And there it was. The mirror stood at the center of the room, its frame tarnished and cracked, its surface shimmering with an unnatural light. The cracks had spread, branching out like veins, but the glass was intact, holding something within its depths that wasn't a reflection. It was a portal, a window into a darkness that felt alive. The symbols carved into its frame pulsed faintly, their edges glowing with a dim, eerie light. One by one, they approached, the pull stronger now than ever. The mirror called to them, its surface rippling as though waiting for them to touch it. The cabin seemed to fade around them, the walls dissolving into shadow. The mirror was all that remained, its presence filling the space, consuming everything. And then, as they stood before it, the surface began to shift. Something moved within the glass, something dark and formless, its shape twisting and writhing. It pressed against the cracks, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The mirror was no longer a window. It was a door. Chapter 8. The Keeper of Secrets. The mirror pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the heartbeat of something ancient and aware. The cracks in its surface widened imperceptibly, spiderwebbing further with every thrum. Around it, the air shifted, vibrating with an energy that felt both electric and organic. It was alive, and it was watching them. The group stood motionless, their breaths shallow, their bodies locked in a collective tension that bound them together. Time in the cabin felt fluid, stretching and contracting in uneven waves. Minutes felt like hours, hours like fleeting seconds, and the mirror waited. Lily was the first to feel the pull grow stronger, sharper. It wasn't just a tug in her chest anymore. It was a presence wrapping itself around her, seeping into her thoughts, her memories. She saw herself reflected in the glass, but it wasn't a reflection at all. It was her, but not her. The other version of her was standing in a field, the sky above roiling with black clouds. The trees in the background were unfamiliar, their shapes twisted and alien. The wind whipped through her hair, though she couldn't feel it. Her doppelganger's face was blank, her expression devoid of emotion, but her eyes, those eyes burned with an intensity that made Lily's chest tighten. The figure raised a hand, motioning for her to come closer. Lily stepped back. James felt the weight of the mirror settle on his shoulders like an invisible yoke. The symbols etched into the frame burned in his vision, their meaning just out of reach, tantalizing and maddening. He stared at the glass, trying to see his reflection, but the surface showed nothing but darkness. The darkness moved. At first, it was subtle, a faint ripple that could have been a trick of the light. But then it surged, rolling like a tide, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. He squinted, leaning closer, and the shapes solidified. They were faces, hundreds of them, their features distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. They pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with terror, their hands clawing at the surface as though desperate to escape. James stumbled back, but the faces followed him, their expressions growing more frantic. They weren't trapped in the mirror. They were waiting for him. Mara clutched her notebook tightly, her fingers gripping the edges until they ached. The symbols on the mirror's frame matched the ones in her dreams, the ones she had written without knowing why. Her body felt heavy, her limbs weighted down by an unseen force. The cabin seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing closer, the ceiling lowering. She looked down at the floor, expecting to see the warped planks, but instead, she saw the clearing. She was standing outside, the trees encircling her, their branches woven into an intricate lattice. At the center of the clearing was the mirror, but it wasn't the same. This version was smooth and unbroken, its surface reflecting the world around it with unnatural clarity. She saw herself in the reflection, and for a moment, she felt at peace. But then the reflection changed. Her mirrored self smiled, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down her spine. The figure raised a hand, its fingers curling into a beckoning gesture. Mara blinked, and the vision was gone. Nate's head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, the kind that settled deep behind the eyes and refused to be ignored. He clutched his sketchbook, though he didn't remember picking it up. The pages were heavy, the weight of them unnatural, as though they contained something more than ink and paper. He opened the book, his hands trembling. The first page was blank. So was the second. He flipped through the pages, faster and faster, his heart pounding. They were all blank, every single one. Panic rose in his chest as he reached the last page, and there it was. The cabin. The sketch was rough, hastily drawn, but unmistakable. The details were too precise, the proportions too perfect to be the work of his hand. He stared at the image, his breathing shallow, and then the lines began to move. The cabin shifted, its roof sagging further, its windows cracking. The door creaked open, and something emerged. It was the figure from his earlier sketches, the one he had burned. Its form was indistinct, its edges blurred, but its presence was overwhelming. And then it turned its head, Celeste's legs felt like they were encased in concrete, her feet rooted to the ground as the cabin seemed to tilt around her. The mirror's surface rippled, and she felt its pull deep in her chest, a sensation that was both physical and emotional. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't resist. Her reflection was there, staring back at her. But the longer she looked, the more it changed. The figure in the mirror began to smile, its lips curving upward in a way that felt wrong. The smile stretched too wide, the corners of its mouth reaching its ears. Its eyes darkened, the whites fading into an inky blackness that seemed to spill out of the glass. The reflection reached toward her, its hand pressing against the inside of the mirror. The glass didn't crack or ripple. It simply gave way, bending outward like the surface of water. Celeste stepped back, but the hand followed. The cabin grew darker, the air heavier. The mirror pulsed again, its rhythm quickening. The cracks in its surface glowed faintly, the light seeping out like molten metal. The symbols on the frame shifted, their edges blurring, rearranging themselves into new patterns. The group stood frozen, their bodies locked in place as the mirror began to hum. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating through the floor, the walls, their very bones. And then the hum stopped. The mirror's surface exploded outward, the shards hanging in the air like frozen droplets of water. The cabin dissolved around them, the walls collapsing into shadow, the floor falling away beneath their feet. They were standing in the clearing again, but it wasn't the same. The trees were taller, their branches impossibly thick, their bark etched with the same symbols that had adorned the mirror. The sky above was a churning mass of black clouds, the air heavy with the scent of ozone. At the center of the clearing stood the mirror, whole and unbroken, its surface smooth and reflective. And then, one by one, they saw themselves step through, not their reflections, their shadows. Chapter 9. Ashes in the Wind. The clearing was no longer a place of familiarity. It was a place out of time, suspended in a dimension where reality bled into something darker, more elusive. The trees towered above them, their branches twisting like limbs that reached down, their bark dark and slick with the sheen of moisture that was neither rain nor dew. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the thrum of their own hearts. The mirror stood before them, still and unbroken. It was the only constant in the clearing, the only point of reference in the chaos that now surrounded them. Its surface shimmered, as though it were not a reflection of the world, but of something else, something ancient and unknowable. And then they began to move, though not of their own will. Lily's eyes were fixed on the mirror. She felt as though it had become the center of the universe, drawing her in with a magnetic pull that was both invisible and inescapable. Her body trembled with the weight of the unseen force surrounding her, her limbs stiffening with an unnatural rigidity. She didn't want to take a step forward, but somehow she was moving. Her legs were obeying commands she hadn't given, her feet carrying her toward the mirror as though they were being guided by an invisible hand. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her reflection at all. The Lily in the mirror was different, pale, eyes sunken, a slow, eerie smile twisting her lips. The image of herself shifted, the reflection suddenly pulling away from the glass. It began to step forward, its movements jerky, like a marionette being controlled by strings. Lily's stomach turned as she watched, as if the mirror had swallowed the real her and replaced it with this hollow version. With each step she took toward the mirror, her reflection moved further away from her until it stepped out of the glass entirely. But it was not just her reflection stepping forward. It was something else, something darker, something more malevolent. The mirrored version of her stopped just before the edge of the glass, its grin widening, its eyes gleaming with a cold, inhuman light. James felt the ground tremble beneath him, the faint vibration traveling up through the soles of his shoes. He looked down, but there was nothing there. No explanation for the sensation that crawled up his spine. His eyes darted back to the mirror. It wasn't just pulling at Lily anymore. It was pulling at all of them. It was as if the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a door, and they were the ones being called through it. He tried to resist, forcing his body to move against the pull, but it was no use. The weight of the atmosphere pressed in on him, too heavy to ignore, like 1,000 invisible hands pushing him toward the mirror. He felt the air grow colder, the moisture in the air thickening, until every breath he took felt like it was wrapped in ice. The mirrored version of himself appeared, standing just inside the glass, staring at him with eyes that weren't his own. The figure in the mirror looked tired, worn down by time and struggle, but its gaze was sharp, predatory. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the mirror as if it were made of water, its form rippling as it passed through. James staggered backward, but the world seemed to tilt with him, the ground beneath him shifting and contorting like the surface of the ocean in a storm. He tried to steady himself, to focus on the reality around him, but everything was changing. The trees around him weren't just trees anymore. They were something else, living, breathing, alive in a way that made him question whether they were even trees at all. He turned to look at the others, but they weren't where they had been a moment ago. They had all been swallowed by the shifting chaos, and James was alone in the clearing, standing before the mirror that now seemed to stretch into infinity. Mara's vision blurred as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The clearing was shifting around her, the trees bending and twisting, their shadows reaching long, clawed fingers toward her. The air had grown thick, and her chest felt tight, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on her from all sides. Her notebook was heavy in her pocket, but when she reached for it, she found it missing. Panic surged inside her, and she looked around frantically, trying to find the small book that had been her constant companion. But it was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was something else, something strange. A soft, melodic sound filled the air, drifting toward her from the trees. It was a voice, distant and faint, but it felt like it was coming from within her own mind. She strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, garbled, as though they were being spoken underwater. Her head swam with dizziness, and she stumbled toward the mirror, compelled by the same pull that had taken hold of the others. Her reflection was waiting for her, its features as smooth and perfect as her own, but something was wrong. The reflection was distorted. The colors were muted, the edges blurred, as though the reflection existed on the edge of her perception, just out of reach. But then the reflection reached out to her. A hand, her hand, but not, pressed against the glass. The fingers curled, the nails sharp and black as obsidian. It was like something was growing out of her, pulling at her from the inside, urging her to join it on the other side. Nate had never felt more detached from reality in his life. He had always been sensitive to the way the world shifted, the way the smallest details could seem out of place. But now the world around him was more than just out of place. It was wrong. The shadows beneath the trees were deep and stretching, longer than they should have been, moving in ways that defied natural laws. The sky above was black, swirling with thick clouds, but it wasn't the clouds that made his heart race. It was the way the sky seemed to open up in places, revealing dark, cavernous depths that threatened to swallow everything. He looked at the mirror, and he saw the figure. It was him, but it wasn't. The mirrored Nate was older, his face haggard, his eyes sunken into shadows. His clothes were torn, his skin covered in strange symbols, like something had crawled beneath his skin and twisted its way out. The figure in the mirror grinned at him, the expression twisted and mocking. Then, the figure did something that sent Nate's heart into his throat. It reached up to its neck and tore at the skin, pulling it away like cloth, revealing a hollow, blackened void beneath. The figure's smile widened impossibly as its hollow eyes locked onto Nate's. Nate could feel the mirror reaching for him. It wanted him to step forward. Celeste felt the world stretch and fold around her as she stumbled toward the mirror. It seemed like the very fabric of reality was unraveling, the trees twisting and collapsing into nothingness. The sky above them had turned a sickly yellow, and the air felt thick, oppressive, as though the weight of the universe was pressing down on her chest. When she looked into the mirror, she saw herself, but her reflection was wrong. The Celeste in the mirror was smiling, but it wasn't a smile of comfort or reassurance. It was something sinister, something that felt predatory. Her reflection raised one hand, as if to beckon her closer. It was the moment she realized this wasn't a mirror. This was a trap. The group was no longer together. They had been scattered, each standing before their own twisted reflection, each feeling the grip of the mirror tighten around them. The clearing was gone, and they were alone in the dark expanse of the forest, their own nightmares closing in around them. And then, the ground cracked open beneath their feet. The hollow earth had awakened. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Basement. The world that surrounded them had become a canvas of fractured edges, each piece splintering into 1,000 shards, each shard reflecting only confusion and fear. The clearing had disappeared, replaced by an expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. The trees were gone, leaving only dark, endless stretches of nothing. The ground beneath their feet was no longer solid, but instead felt as though it were suspended in midair, hovering above an abyss that seemed to hum with a low, haunting resonance. Where the others had stood, there was no sign, no trace, no sound. It was as if they had been swallowed whole, consumed by the same void that had turned the world inside out. Lily could still feel it, the tug of the mirror. It was a pull she couldn't resist, a force that flowed through her like liquid fire. It burned through her veins, whispered in her mind, urging her to move forward. She couldn't stop herself, even though every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to run, to escape the darkness that seemed to be closing in on her from every side. She stumbled forward, her body moving without her consent, each step taking her deeper into the abyss. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, like walking on a surface that could crumble at any moment. But there was nothing, no escape, no way back. The air around her grew heavier with each passing moment, thickening like smoke. The very fabric of reality seemed to be distorting, pulling at the seams of what she knew to be true. Shadows stretched and shifted, curling around her as though they were alive, their forms constantly changing, never solid. They flickered at the edges of her vision, just out of reach, teasing her with their presence before disappearing again. She didn't know how long she had been walking. Time had lost all meaning here. It could have been hours, days, or mere minutes. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the mirror that had brought them here. She knew it, even without seeing it. It was pulling her in, guiding her forward, its invisible tendrils sinking into her mind, into her soul. James felt the ground crack beneath his feet, the earth shifting in unnatural ways, as though it had become nothing more than a fragile layer stretched over an infinite void. The trees had disappeared, replaced by dark, gaping spaces where the sky had once been. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, a stillness that felt like it was drowning him. His chest tightened, each breath a laborious effort, as though the very air had turned to lead. He looked around, his mind racing, searching for something, anything, to anchor him to reality. But there was nothing. No sign of the others. No sign of anything familiar. Just shadows. The landscape had become unrecognizable, warped, and twisted. The horizon stretched out before him in a sickening curvature, as though the world itself had folded in on itself. The path beneath his feet seemed to wind and bend in impossible directions, as though it were a spiral leading downward into the depths of a dream he could never escape. The darkness around him was thick, suffocating, and he could feel it closing in, the weight of it pressing against his body, threatening to crush him. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A flicker, a movement. It was the mirror. It stood in the distance, its surface smooth and unbroken, gleaming faintly in the unnatural gloom. He didn't know how he knew, but he understood with a cold certainty. The mirror was the key. It was the reason they had ended up here, and it was the only way out. But the closer he got, the further away it seemed. It was like chasing the horizon, a never-ending pursuit that led him deeper into the void. The world around him twisted and warped, every step he took dragging him further into the abyss. Mara's hands shook as she pressed them against her sides, trying to steady herself. The ground underfoot was unstable, shifting like sand beneath her feet, pulling her down with each step. She couldn't see where she was going. Everything around her was an endless blur of shadows and darkness, a deep, oppressive void that seemed to swallow every trace of light. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the dampness seeping into her clothes, her skin. She tried to call out, to reach for something, anything that would bring her back to herself, back to the others. But the silence was absolute. It was a silence that ate away at her thoughts, her consciousness, until all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her chest, the sound of blood rushing in her ears. She had no idea how long she had been walking. There were no landmarks, no features in the landscape to help her track time, just the endless stretch of nothingness. But there was something. She knew it. She could feel it, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The air seemed to shift around her, vibrating with an energy that wasn't there before. It was a hum that reverberated through her bones, through her very being, and in the distance, she saw it. The mirror. It was a dark shape against the blankness, its surface rippling in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The mirror was like a window, a portal into something else. She knew that it was the source of everything. The distortion of the world around her, the sense of creeping terror that had settled in her chest. She couldn't look away. She had to move toward it, step by step, drawn by an irresistible force that was both terrifying and undeniable. Nate's feet dragged across the ground as he stumbled through the endless void. His body felt heavy, each movement slow and labored as though the very air had become thick and suffocating. He had no idea where he was, or even how long he had been walking. The world around him was a blur, an indistinct mass of shadows and shifting shapes that seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, teasing him with their fleeting presence. He was alone, completely alone. He hadn't seen the others in what felt like an eternity. It was as if they had been swallowed by the darkness, vanished without a trace. His only companion was the faint hum in the air, a low, pulsating sound that seemed to resonate within his chest, making his heart beat in time with it. The ground beneath him shifted again, the earth cracking open in strange, jagged lines. The world seemed to be folding inward, its edges collapsing on themselves, warping the very fabric of reality. He could feel it, feel the pressure, the weight, pushing in from every direction. It was suffocating. It was inescapable. And then, like a beacon in the dark, he saw it. The mirror. It wasn't where it had been before. It wasn't standing still, waiting for her to reach it. Now it was moving, shifting in and out of existence, its surface rippling like water. It was a distorted reflection, an image that bent and stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. But the pull, it was undeniable. She moved toward it, her steps slow and heavy, her body unwilling but compelled. Each step felt like it took her further away from the world she knew, further into the unknown. The mirror was the only constant in this madness, the only thing that seemed real, and that terrified her more than anything else. As each of them moved closer to the mirror, their paths seemed to converge. The landscape shifted beneath their feet, guiding them toward the same destination. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was a force. It was a beginning and an end. It was the key to the world they had found themselves in and the doorway to what lay beyond. The darkness around them thickened, pressing in on them from every side, the hum in the air growing louder, more insistent. The pull became unbearable, each of them helpless to stop the inevitable. The mirror was waiting, and whatever was beyond it was closer than they could ever have imagined. Chapter 11. The Map We Burned. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It had become something else, something more tangible and yet more elusive. It was like a doorway to another world, a threshold between the known and the unknown, and as each of them drew closer, the reality around them seemed to bend and shudder, as if it too feared the crossing. The landscape had dissolved entirely now, replaced by an overwhelming emptiness. There were no longer trees or ground beneath their feet, only an endless, yawning chasm stretching in every direction. The air hung thick, saturated with a tension that felt like static, crawling beneath their skin, gnawing at their nerves. Each breath was a struggle, a conscious effort, and the sound of their heartbeat echoed too loudly in their ears. There was no sound from the others now. They had become mere shadows in the distance, faint glimpses of form, each drawn toward the mirror in a silent, unspoken procession. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if their legs were weighed down by the very gravity of this place, as though the world itself was pulling them toward the unknown. Their bodies, once full of life, now felt like they were simply being dragged forward, as though they were no longer in control of their own actions. The mirror stood before them, its surface rippling like liquid. The surface no longer reflected the world around them. Instead, it seemed to contain something else, a swirling, black void, an empty space that stretched infinitely inwards. It was as though the mirror itself had become a living thing, and the image it projected was not a reflection, but a portal to something far darker. Lily reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the mirror. The moment her skin touched the glass, a surge of energy shot through her, a violent jolt that left her breathless. The mirror pulsed with a sickly light, and she recoiled, her body instinctively pulling back. But the pull was not from her own will. It was the mirror that was drawing her in, like a tidal force that could not be ignored. The world around her swirled, twisting and contorting, and for a moment, it felt as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shatter into fragments, the earth splitting open like the skin of a fruit, revealing a black, bottomless pit that threatened to swallow everything. The horizon was no longer a fixed point. It had become a swirling vortex, twisting in on itself, collapsing in every direction. The emptiness stretched on forever, swallowing everything in its path. Her heartbeat quickened, and she took a step back, but it was as if the space between them and the mirror had shrunk. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world dissolving into a dark haze. The air grew thicker, colder, until every breath felt like ice cutting through her lungs. And then, the mirror's pull intensified, its power growing stronger by the second. It was as if the very air itself had become charged with electricity, thrumming with an unearthly energy that pulsed through her veins. There was no escaping it. James watched from a distance, his body frozen in place, unable to move as he saw Lily step forward, her body drawn toward the mirror as if by invisible strings. His legs felt like they were encased in cement, his feet sinking into the nothingness around him, as if the ground itself had given way. The darkness around him felt suffocating, pressing in from every side, but the mirror called to him, its surface rippling in an impossible way. He tried to tear his gaze away, but his eyes were glued to it, like a moth drawn to a flame. The darkness in the mirror was not the absence of light, but the presence of something else, something old, something beyond comprehension. It was as if the mirror itself contained the secrets of the universe, things that had been lost to time, things that had never belonged to the world they had come from. His pulse raced in his chest, each beat pounding in his ears like a drum. His hands were clammy, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into a bottomless pit, knowing that there was no turning back. Every instinct told him to turn and run, to escape the pull of the mirror. But his body refused to obey. Instead, his feet shuffled forward, drawn toward it as if they were being dragged by an unseen force. He stumbled, his legs weak beneath him, and then his hands found the cold, unyielding surface of the mirror. The moment he touched it, a shock ran through his body, a burst of cold that spread from his fingertips and exploded outward, filling every part of him with a searing, painful energy. It felt as though his very bones were being torn apart, as though the mirror was drawing out his soul and leaving nothing behind. He tried to pull away, but it was no use. The mirror had him now, its grip unrelenting, its pull irresistible. The world around him began to disintegrate, the edges of reality blurring into an unrecognizable mess of shifting shapes and colors. The ground beneath his feet crumbled away, and the sky above him split open like an ancient wound, pouring darkness into the world, filling it with a cold, oppressive silence. And still, the mirror held him, dragging him forward, deeper into the black void beyond. Mara couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. It was impossible to look away, impossible to resist the pull. It was as if the very essence of her being had been magnetized to it, as if her soul had been carved to fit into the shape of the mirror. Every fiber of her body screamed for escape, but there was no escape. There was only the mirror. Her mind raced as she took a step forward, her legs trembling beneath her, her breath ragged as the darkness around her pressed in from all sides. She could feel the air growing colder, more suffocating, and still, she moved forward, compelled by forces she could neither understand nor control. The moment her fingers brushed the surface of the mirror, her body went rigid. A sharp, violent pain shot through her chest, like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. The mirror shimmered, and for a brief moment, she saw something beyond it. A figure. It was her. No, it wasn't. It was a twisted, grotesque version of herself, one that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The figure's eyes glowed with a dark, unnatural light, and its mouth stretched into a grin that was more a snarl than a smile. The reflection reached out, its hand forming into a claw, its fingers stretching toward her. It was as if it wanted to pull her into the mirror, to consume her. And Mara realized in that instant that the mirror was not simply a reflection. It was a doorway, a gateway to something far more terrifying. Nate was almost there. The mirror was so close now, the void beyond it so near that he could almost taste it, the coldness pressing against his skin like an invisible weight. The blackness around him pressed in, suffocating him, each breath feeling like it was being stolen from his lungs. His vision was dimming, and the pull of the mirror was growing stronger with every passing second. It was the only thing left in this place, the only thing that mattered. As he neared it, the world around him began to fold, the edges of reality curling up like frayed paper. The ground disappeared beneath his feet, replaced by a vast, empty space, a chasm that threatened to open up and swallow him whole. And then, with no warning, he reached it. The moment his fingers touched the mirror's surface, a violent shock ran through him, jolting his entire body. It was as if every nerve in his body was on fire, as though his very being was being torn apart and reassembled in an instant. The pain was unbearable, and yet it was nothing compared to the utter void that seemed to rise up from within the mirror, pulling at him, sucking him toward it. The world twisted around him, collapsing inward, and he was falling into the dark abyss of the mirror's depths. Celeste was the last to approach the mirror, her body moving on its own, her mind lost in a haze of confusion and fear. The space around her was warping, folding in on itself, the edges of reality fraying and unraveling. She could feel it. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was a doorway, a gateway to something ancient, something powerful and dark. Her hand reached out, trembling as she neared it. She could feel the cold radiating from its surface, the air crackling with an energy that made her skin prickle. It was almost as if the mirror was waiting for her, expecting her. When her hand made contact, it was as if the entire world collapsed. The darkness enveloped her completely, and the world outside the mirror faded into nothing. The moment they all touched the mirror, the air thickened with an almost tangible pressure, and reality itself seemed to shatter. They were no longer in the place they had been, no longer in the landscape they had walked through. They had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. Chapter 12, Through the Needle's Eye. The moment they crossed the threshold of the mirror, time itself seemed to lose its meaning. The world they had known, every shape, every color, every sound, had vanished. There was no ground beneath their feet, no air to breathe, only an oppressive darkness that surrounded them, pulling them deeper into a void that felt endless. They were no longer in the world they had left behind. They had entered something else, something entirely alien, and the sheer scale of it was suffocating. Lily's body felt weightless, as though she were suspended in a state between being and non-being. She couldn't see, couldn't feel the solid touch of the earth beneath her, yet she knew she was moving. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, closing in with a crushing intensity. It was like being surrounded by the blackest ocean, one that swallowed all light, all sense of direction, until there was nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat. It was the only thing that reminded her that she was still alive, still here, but she couldn't tell where here was anymore. Her senses were dulled, as if her body had been stripped of everything that made it real. She felt herself moving, as though guided by an unseen hand, floating toward something, but she had no idea what it could be. The air, or what she assumed was air, had no texture, no warmth. It was a vacuum, a breathless place, and yet it pressed in on her like a storm cloud, suffocating, pressing against her chest, making it impossible to take a full breath. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She opened her mouth, but her words were lost to the nothingness. James, too, felt the world around him shift and change in ways he couldn't understand. He was no longer sure of where his body ended and the space around him began. The sense of disconnection was overwhelming. It was as if his limbs had become part of the darkness itself, no longer separate from the void. It was all the same. He could see nothing. He could hear nothing. The air seemed to close in on him, pressing him from all sides, and yet there was no sensation of touch, no tangible pressure. There was only the sense of being pulled, of drifting in a vast emptiness that felt both alien and suffocating. In the distance, if it could be called distance in a place without depth, he could feel the presence of something. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an object. It was something much more subtle, something that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of this place. It was as if the void itself was aware of them, watching them, waiting for them to react. His pulse quickened, the only indication that he was still alive. His skin prickled, though he wasn't sure if it was a physical sensation or just his mind trying to make sense of the void. But the emptiness around him was palpable, an oppressive weight that he couldn't escape. He could feel it pulling at him, drawing him in. It was as though there were a force at the very center of this place, a source of something that both terrified and intrigued him. But he had no control. No control over his body, no control over his mind. His legs, his arms, everything felt like it was floating away, becoming part of the blackness. He tried to concentrate, tried to remember what had brought him here, but the memories slipped through his fingers like smoke. There was nothing to hold on to anymore, nothing to anchor him to the life he had known. Mara, caught in the same disorienting drift, felt as if her body were being torn in opposite directions. It was as though she was being stretched, pulled, twisted by forces she couldn't comprehend. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to hold on to something, anything, to remind herself that she existed. But the more she focused, the more she realized that the very concept of her existence had become fluid, mutable. She couldn't tell where she began and where this dark expanse ended. It was as though she had entered a space where the rules of reality no longer applied. There was no time, no up, no down. She was suspended in an endless abyss, and the more she tried to fight against it, the more it seemed to consume her. She felt cold. No, colder than cold. A kind of numbness that went beyond sensation, beyond understanding. There was no warmth here, no comfort. It was as if the very nature of this place had stripped her of everything that made her human. And yet, she wasn't afraid. No, it was something worse. It was the absence of fear, the absence of any emotion at all. It was as though everything, every part of her, had been drained away, leaving only a hollow shell that floated endlessly in the dark. She closed her eyes, though she knew there was no point. The darkness was absolute, all-encompassing. And then, suddenly, she felt it. A pulse, a vibration beneath her skin, a sound, not heard but felt, as though the very fabric of the void was resonating with some hidden frequency. She couldn't explain it, but the pulse was there, and it seemed to draw her toward it. Nate's senses were spinning. He could no longer tell if he was falling, floating, or simply existing in a suspended state between all of those possibilities. The air around him was thick and heavy, but there was no weight. He tried to lift his arm, but it felt as though his limbs were made of smoke, dissolving into the darkness with every motion. He couldn't feel his fingers. He couldn't feel his toes. His body had become a ghost, a specter drifting in a place that had no name. There was something hauntingly familiar about this place. The absence of everything made it feel like a memory he couldn't quite reach, a forgotten dream that teetered on the edge of his mind but refused to come into focus. He had been here before, in some other form, in some other time. He was sure of it. The more he struggled to understand, the more he realized there was nothing to hold on to. Nothing but the darkness, the silence, and the strange pulse that now seemed to surround him, like a heartbeat in the distance. It wasn't a physical thing. It was deeper than that. A presence, something that resonated with the deepest parts of his being, something that called out to him. He wasn't sure if it was the force of the mirror that had brought him here, or if he had somehow crossed into another realm altogether. But there was one thing he did know. Whatever lay ahead was beyond comprehension, and he had no choice but to follow it. Celeste felt a strange sensation creeping into her thoughts, a coldness that wasn't just physical. It was as though her mind itself was being stripped of its walls, its defenses. She could feel the edges of her identity starting to blur, starting to dissipate. The void she drifted through didn't just distort the world around her. It seemed to distort her perception, as if reality itself were being filtered through a lens of madness. She had no idea where the others were, whether they were beside her or lost in the distance. There was no way to tell. The very concept of distance had ceased to exist in this place. She wasn't sure where her body was anymore, or even if it was still her body at all. It felt as though she were dissolving into the darkness, a part of it, yet still separate, still aware, still trying to hold on. And then, she felt it. The pulse. It resonated through her, vibrating through her bones, making her skin tingle with a strange and unexplainable energy. It was a call, a beckoning, a promise. But a promise of what? She couldn't say. There was no way to know. The darkness stretched on, and yet, somehow, the pulse grew louder, more insistent. It was pulling them all toward it, drawing them closer to whatever was at the center of this void. And whether they wanted to or not, whether they understood or not, they were all being drawn to it. The void seemed endless. The pull of the darkness, the resonance of the pulse, became the only constants in a place that defied all logic. The characters drifted, each one lost in their own sensations, their own experiences, but bound together by the same force. The pulse, the call. It beckoned them forward, deeper into the unknown. But what awaited them? And would they survive whatever lay on the other side? Chapter 13. What the river took. The pulse grew stronger. It was not a sound in the conventional sense. It was not a vibration, a tremor, or a thrum of electricity. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of their consciousness, pulling at their very essence. It was an unnatural force, emanating from somewhere beyond their reach. But it was there, ever present, throbbing with an ancient energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. It was as though it were calling to them, coaxing them forward, drawing them into something far beyond the void they had already crossed. At first, the light was nothing. It was an absence, a hollow place where even darkness seemed to be afraid to linger. But slowly, imperceptibly, a strange glow began to manifest in the distance. It was faint at first, almost like a star flickering weakly in the vast expanse of space. But the longer they drifted, the stronger it grew, pulsing like a heartbeat. The edges of the light were jagged, fragmented, as if it were trying to break free from the oppressive darkness that surrounded it. Lily felt it first, though she could not say how or why. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change so slight that it could have easily been overlooked. But her senses, raw and overstimulated, caught it instantly. The air around her seemed to stir, an invisible current brushing against her skin, and she could feel the darkness shifting. It was as though the very void she had been suspended in for what felt like an eternity was no longer still. It was alive, pulsing, thrumming with a faint energy that seemed to call her name. The light was beckoning her, pulling her toward it with an unrelenting force, as though she were being drawn by a magnet. The void seemed to part in front of her, shifting like the surface of a disturbed lake. The weightlessness that had once enveloped her now seemed less oppressive. It was as if she had broken free from the darkness for the first time. Her limbs, though still numb, felt as though they were moving again, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, carried by some unseen current. She reached out instinctively, though she knew there was nothing to grasp. There was no solid form in this space, no ground beneath her, only the pulsing light that seemed to draw nearer with each passing moment. And yet, the closer she got to it, the more she realized that it was not just the light she was heading toward. It was something else, something deeper, hidden within the light's jagged edges. The pulse seemed to carry a meaning that she could not yet understand. James could feel the shift as well, though it was almost imperceptible. His body, still floating in the cold void, had long since lost its sense of time. It was as though the passage of moments had become irrelevant, a concept that no longer applied in this strange, undefined space. The darkness pressed in around him, but he had grown used to it. It was familiar, almost comforting in its oppressive stillness. Then the light appeared. It was faint at first, barely noticeable against the suffocating dark, but as it grew stronger, it was impossible to ignore. It was not like any light he had ever seen. It was jagged, sharp, unnatural in its brightness, as though it were somehow fracturing reality itself. It seemed to bend the very air around it, warping the space through which it passed. The pulse that accompanied it was rhythmic, like the beating of some ancient heart, each throb sending a shockwave through the void. There was a subtle, almost magnetic pull to it, something that reached deep into his chest, tugging at the very core of his being. At first, he resisted, but soon enough, he found that he could not. The force was too strong. It was not just the light that was calling him. It was the pulse, the resonance, the energy that seemed to radiate from the very heart of the light itself. It was as though the pulse was tied to his very essence, a language he could not speak but could somehow understand, a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. His limbs, once heavy and unresponsive, seemed to stir with a renewed urgency. The dark space around him seemed to give way, parting like a curtain, as though the light was pushing through the barriers of this place, carving a path to something that lay beyond. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. This was no ordinary light. This was something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. The distance between him and the light shrank with every passing moment, and yet it seemed like he was moving at a pace that was too slow. It felt as if the space itself were stretching, making the distance greater even as he approached. The pull was unbearable now. It was not just a physical compulsion. It was something in his very soul that screamed for him to come closer, to understand, to witness whatever lay on the other side of this radiant barrier. Mara felt the light before she saw it. It started as a hum, a low resonance in her chest that vibrated through her ribs and settled in the pit of her stomach. It was not unpleasant. No, it was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. Her senses, dulled by the emptiness of this place, were suddenly alive again. The cold, numbing darkness that had gripped her for so long began to recede, replaced by a warmth that was not heat, but something far more alien. It was like the light had a presence, a consciousness of its own, that recognized her and welcomed her. The pulse thrummed louder now, each beat a force that reverberated in her very bones, calling her forward. Her limbs, which had felt like lead only moments ago, moved again, driven by an unseen hand. The distance between her and the light was shrinking, pulling her closer to its source, and yet, even as she moved toward it, she could feel the space around her warping, bending under the weight of the energy that surged through the air. And then it was there. The light was not warm as she had expected. No, it was cold, but not in the way the void had been cold. This was a different kind of cold, one that filled her with a strange sense of both dread and wonder. The light itself seemed to pulse with an inner energy, a force that crackled through the air like static electricity. The jagged edges of it flickered like broken glass, sharp and unnatural, cutting through the darkness. It was beautiful and terrifying, all at once. There was something beyond it, something hidden within. It was as though the light itself were a veil, obscuring the truth of what lay on the other side. But the pull was undeniable. She had to move forward. She had to understand. Nate's body, which had felt like it was disintegrating in the void, began to take form again. It was a gradual process, as though his essence was slowly being reconstructed from the particles of this strange place. The light reached him before he even saw it, a strange warmth filling his chest, drawing him toward it. At first, it was nothing more than a faint glow, a slight flicker in the distance. But as he moved, or perhaps as the space itself moved around him, the light grew stronger, brighter. The pulse reverberated through him now, so loud in his chest that he could feel it rattling his bones. It was as though the very core of his being had been ignited, an electric spark that spread outward, through his limbs, through his mind. He felt alive again. His senses were returning, sharpened by the proximity to this unknown force. But there was something unsettling about it too. The closer he got, the more he could sense that this light was not something to be embraced blindly. There was danger in it, something hidden beneath the surface. Yet, he could not resist. The pull was irresistible. Celeste was the last to feel it, though she could not say why. The others were already moving toward the light, already drawn into its radiance. But for her, it was as though the world around her had stopped, holding her in place for a fraction of a second before everything began to shift. The light, no longer faint, but blazing now, was not just a physical object. It was something else, something more. It was consciousness. It was time. It was space. And it was calling her. Her movements, like the others, were involuntary. She was drawn toward the light, pulled in by a force far stronger than any will she possessed. The darkness receded, parting like the sea before the rising sun. It was a slow and deliberate process, as though the very fabric of this place were stretching to allow them through. The moment she crossed into the light, her world shattered. The pulse intensified, the sound of her heartbeat merging with the rhythmic beats of the light. The space around her flickered and shifted, and she felt as though she were falling, plunging into an abyss of light and shadow. But there was no fear, no panic, only the pull, the call, drawing her into the unknown. The characters, now fully within the grasp of the light's pull, have crossed into a new realm. What lies ahead is not certain, but the moment they entered this space, they felt the undeniable force guiding them forward, compelling them to move toward whatever awaited on the other side. The boundaries of time and space have become fluid, distorted, and they are left with the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that whatever happens next is out of their control. Chapter 14. The silence between heartbeats. The light had consumed them, but it wasn't the kind of light they had expected, warm, golden, gentle. It was a blistering, unrelenting force, a consuming blaze that shattered all their previous notions of reality. It was not light at all. It was something else, something incomprehensible, something that bent the very fabric of existence. At first, they could feel nothing but the overwhelming force of its presence. Their bodies seemed to dissolve into it, their forms stretching, rippling, distorting, until they no longer felt solid, no longer felt themselves. It was as though the light were not simply surrounding them, but invading them, seeping into their very cells, altering their perceptions, rewriting the rules of their being. It was disorienting. It was all-consuming. It was an intrusion that defied logic. But it wasn't just the light. It was the space around them, the space between them, the way everything seemed to bend and break. The light wasn't just something external. It was inside them, too. It was not just illuminating their path. It was consuming their memories, their thoughts, their very essence. The world around them had become something altogether different. The light, though still present, was not constant. It pulsed, flickering in and out like a malfunctioning star. And as it did, the air, or what passed for air in this place, seemed to shift in response, becoming thick, dense, almost liquid. The ground, which they had once thought non-existent, now felt like a solid presence beneath their feet. But it was no longer stable. It was as if they were walking on a surface made of glass, each step fragile, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. The horizon, which had seemed to stretch endlessly, now curved unnaturally. There were no clear shapes, no real sense of space. There were fragments, broken slivers of reality, scattered like pieces of a shattered mirror. Each piece reflected something different, something out of sync with everything else. A city skyline, twisted and warped. A forest, half buried in a sandstorm. A distant, shattered moon. The fractured images flickered in and out of existence, as though they were memories or dreams that refused to settle into a coherent form. They couldn't tell where one image ended and the next began. The landscape twisted, then straightened, then twisted again, as though it were trapped in an endless loop of becoming and unbecoming. Lily was the first to notice the cracks. At first, they were small, almost imperceptible, faint fissures in the air, as though reality itself were starting to break apart. But the longer she stood there, watching the light pulse and flicker, the more she realized that the fractures were growing, spreading like the cracks in the shell of a broken egg. Her heart raced in response. There was something deeply wrong with the way the world was shifting. The light, which had once been a source of power, was now unstable, a fire on the brink of going out. Each flicker seemed to weaken it further, and with every flicker, the cracks grew deeper. What had once been a single, unified reality was now splintering into countless versions of itself. It was no longer a place of simply light and dark. It was chaos. Lily reached out, her hand trembling as she touched one of the fissures in the air. Her fingers sank into it, and she felt a rush of coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, but with something far more profound. It was as though she were touching the very foundation of existence itself. The cracks seemed to pulse under her touch, as though responding to her presence, and for a brief moment, the world around her bent violently, the fractured pieces shifting into new, strange shapes before snapping back into place. But something had changed. Something had broken. James had been watching the landscape shift and fracture, too. His mind struggled to process the images that flickered before him, none of them making sense. He couldn't understand how the space had changed so rapidly, how the air had become so dense, or why his surroundings had become so unstable. It was as though the very essence of reality was being undone, piece by piece. He stepped forward, cautiously, unsure of what to expect. His feet sank slightly into the surface beneath him, like stepping into thick, wet sand. But the texture was all wrong, soft, but jagged, shifting with every movement. His eyes were fixed on a crack that had appeared just ahead of him, a deep fissure that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. He could see through it, but there was nothing on the other side, only a darkness that swallowed the light whole. He stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. The crack seemed to pull at him, as if it were a doorway, a passage into something more, something beyond. His heart thudded in his chest. He felt the pull of it, the magnetic force that seemed to reach into him and draw out his thoughts, his memories. The void beneath him seemed to be calling him. The pulse that had guided them this far was now fading, replaced by a silence that was almost deafening. What was this place? What had they entered? Was it even real? As he stood there, gazing into the crack, something flickered in the air beside him. A shard of light, thin and fragile, appeared out of nowhere. It hovered for a moment, suspended in the air like a breath held too long. Then it shattered, disappearing into the void with a sound like glass breaking. He stepped back, the pulse of fear creeping into his chest. He had the feeling that everything around him was on the verge of breaking, of collapsing entirely. He could feel it in his bones, in the air that seemed to vibrate with the anticipation of something terrible, something inevitable. Mara could feel it too. The crack in the fabric of their world had deepened, and with it came the sense that they were all caught in the middle of something far larger than they had ever imagined. The landscape that had seemed so alien was no longer simply alien. It was hostile. Each step she took seemed to tear at the edges of the reality around her, as though the ground beneath her was being slowly devoured by an insatiable hunger. The pulse, the rhythm that had guided them, pulled them forward, was now faint, distant, as though it were dying, fading into silence. The once stable air now seemed to vibrate with an almost unbearable tension, the atmosphere heavy with the scent of decay. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, but she couldn't turn back. There was nowhere to go. The only direction was forward. And still, the cracks deepened. There were whispers now, though they had no mouths, no voices to speak. It was the faintest of sounds, like the flutter of wings in the distance, but it was everywhere. The whispers seemed to move within the cracks, weaving in and out of the fractured pieces of reality that surrounded her. The sound, though faint, carried with it a weight of knowledge, an ancient knowledge that she could almost grasp, but not quite. It was as though the void were speaking to her, offering her glimpses of things beyond her comprehension. The air grew colder, and she shuddered despite herself. She didn't understand, but she knew one thing. They were not alone in this place. There was something else here, something older, something watching. Nate, too, was aware of the changes. The cracks, the shifting light, the strange, fractured landscape. It all felt like a nightmare. The world no longer made sense. The ground beneath him wasn't solid, wasn't real. His thoughts, too, felt fragmented. The further he moved through this distorted space, the more his mind seemed to lose its anchor, like a ship drifting in an endless sea, without direction, without purpose. But there was something else, a presence, or perhaps a memory, clawing at the edges of his consciousness. Something familiar, something he had forgotten. He couldn't place it. It was too distant, but it lingered, like a scent on the wind. The world around him seemed to shift again, the cracks growing wider, revealing dark, empty spaces behind them. Each step he took brought him closer to the center, to whatever lay at the heart of this strange, fractured reality. And as he moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that the very landscape was alive, that it was watching them, studying them, as though it were waiting for them to make a decision. Every step forward felt like a step closer to the edge. Celeste, too, could feel the change. The very air seemed to hum with anticipation, a pressure building in the space around her. The fractures were widening, deepening, as though the fabric of this place was coming apart at the seams. Her own sense of self felt splintered, stretched thin by the pressure, as though she were no longer entirely sure where she ended and the space around her began. She had the strangest sensation that she wasn't supposed to be here, that they weren't supposed to be here. This place wasn't meant for them. And yet, here they were, drawn deeper with each passing moment, pulled toward a fate they couldn't control. The cracks deepened, and somewhere, beneath the surface of the fractured world, something stirred. Something old, something waiting. And Celeste had the chilling realization that they were nearing the point of no return. Chapter 15, where we leave the light on. There was no sound, no echoes, no whispers, no sign of anything at all. The absence of everything was suffocating, pressing down like a weight on the air itself. It was as though the universe had gone silent, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something beyond time, beyond space, beyond understanding. The fractured reality that had enveloped them now felt distant, thin, like the last remnant of a dream that clung to the edges of the waking world. The cracks had widened and stretched further, revealing the void beneath. It was as though all of existence was on the cusp of dissolution, unraveling, or perhaps being reborn. It was impossible to tell which. There was no way to know. They had long since lost track of the passage of time, the movement of the world around them. They had become part of this place. The void had pulled them into its depths, and there was no way out. Lily walked forward, her body moving almost without her consent. The pressure in the air was growing stronger, pushing against her chest, as though the very space around her had become an invisible force, resisting every step she took. The light, once so prominent, was now a dim, flickering glow in the distance, like a dying star in the vast emptiness of a night sky. It had lost its warmth. It had lost its power. Now, it was just another fractured piece of this broken reality. As she moved forward, she could feel the subtle pull, the draw toward the center, toward the place where the cracks had converged. There was no rational thought left, no room for reason, no sense of direction. It was as if every instinct she had, every fragment of her identity, had been absorbed into the stillness of the void, leaving behind only a primal force that urged her onward. She reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed the air, expecting nothing. But there was a resistance, a ripple, like something unseen shifting just beneath the surface. She pulled her hand back, heart pounding. It was the sensation of crossing a threshold, as though she had just touched something forbidden, something she was not meant to understand. It was then that she realized the void was alive. It wasn't a space devoid of life. It was a presence, an ancient force that had been waiting, stretching across the ages, watching them, drawing them closer. There was a weight to it, a suffocating, pervasive pressure that seemed to twist the air around them, like the tightening grip of a hand slowly closing in. This was not just an empty place. It was a force that had no beginning and no end, no past and no future. The others were scattered behind her, drawn toward the same pull, though each of them seemed lost in their own world of confusion. James seemed to stumble, his steps unsteady as he fought against the shifting atmosphere. Mara, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder, hesitated as she reached out to touch one of the cracks in the fabric of the air. It rippled in response, but she quickly recoiled, as though she had touched something far older than herself, something that she could never fully comprehend. Yet it was Nate who seemed to be most affected by the shift, his expression grim and distant as he walked, as though his mind had been lost to something deeper, something beyond comprehension. It was as if he were in a trance, his gaze fixed on something that was both real and unreal, something that existed in the space between perception and oblivion. His steps were deliberate, but there was no urgency in his movements. It was as though he was no longer in control of his body, no longer aware of the world around him. And then Celeste. Celeste was different. She had stopped walking altogether. She stood there, perfectly still, her body almost as if frozen in place. Her eyes were closed, her expression serene, but there was something in the air around her that pulsed with a quiet energy. Something had shifted within her. She was no longer a part of the group, no longer one of them. She had crossed into another realm, another dimension, and was now fully absorbed into the void. She wasn't afraid. None of them were. Not anymore. There had been fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what was happening to them. But that fear had faded. Now, there was only the pull, the force that enveloped them, the deep, aching knowledge that they were part of something vast, something immeasurable, something they could never understand. And as they moved forward, something began to form. Not a shape, not an image, but a presence, a feeling of being watched, of being known. It was as though they were no longer alone, though there was no visible presence in the air around them. It was a sensation, like a whisper in the back of their minds, pulling them closer, urging them to move toward the heart of the void. At the center of the fractured world, the cracks converged. It was as though the very fabric of reality had torn open, exposing something far darker, far deeper than any of them had anticipated. They had thought they were nearing the center of the mystery, but what they found was not an answer, but another question, another threshold. The air thickened, becoming viscous, like molasses, each movement a struggle. The light that had once been so strong had now almost entirely disappeared, leaving behind only shadows that stretched out in unnatural shapes, elongating like fingers reaching for them. There was nothing ahead but a darkness so complete that it seemed to consume even the memory of light. Lily felt the weight of the darkness pressing against her, but there was no turning back now. She stepped forward again, her body moving despite herself. The air became colder still, the darkness more intense. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of life except for the heavy pull of the void. The others followed her, drawn by the same invisible force. Mara's eyes darted about, her hands trembling as she moved closer, trying to make sense of the shifting, fractured reality. Nate, still distant, seemed to glide through the space without truly noticing anything around him. Celeste remained silent, her eyes closed, her face serene. At the center of the void, the cracks seemed to collapse inward. But as they did, something began to take shape. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't a being. It was a presence, something ancient, something vast, something beyond time, space, and understanding. It wasn't a god, nor was it a demon. It wasn't something they could name. It was the void itself. It was a force, a creation, an entity that had existed for as long as existence itself. And it spoke to them, not with words, but with a presence, a feeling that washed over them, flooding their minds. It was a feeling of completion, of fulfillment, of knowing. It was as though they had come home, though they had never truly known where home was. In that moment, they understood everything, and they understood nothing, for they were now part of the void, the space between worlds, the place where reality itself came to die and be reborn. They had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. They had entered the heart of the mystery, the center of the endless void, and they were never alone again.